What happens when Hollywood's most respected actor meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when two titans clash in what became the most explosive talk show confrontation in recent memory. The tension was palpable from the moment Denzel Washington stepped onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted the verbal warfare that would erupt, leading to one of the most dramatic exits in television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when respect meets disrespect under the bright studio lights. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other, with the host's typical monologue filled with his signature brand of humor that's been increasingly dividing audiences. But the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Denzel Washington made his entrance. The Academy Award winner, known for his dignity and measured responses, walked out with a smile that seemed forced, his usual warmth replaced by something colder, more calculating. Kimmel's introduction was loaded with barely concealed jabs. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington, fresh off another Oscar-worthy performance where he probably saved the world again," he quipped, his tone dripping with the kind of sarcasm that's become his trademark. The audience laughed, but Denzel's expression remained stone-faced as he settled into the guest chair. "Jimmy," Denzel said, his voice carrying that unmistakable gravitas, "I appreciate the introduction, though I'm not sure what you mean by probably saved the world again." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and even the studio audience seemed to sense the shift in energy. Kimmel, clearly caught off guard by the direct response, tried to deflect with humor. "Oh, you're always playing these heroic characters. The righteous cop, the determined pilot, the man of faith. It's like you've cornered the market on moral superiority." His laugh felt hollow, and the camera caught the subtle tightening around Denzel's eyes. "Is that what you think?" Denzel leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding the space between them. "That playing characters with integrity is somehow—" "What? A marketing strategy?" The question cut through Kimmel's prepared banter like a blade. The host shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence wavering. No, I didn't mean it like that. I just meant you always seem to choose these very serious roles. Don't you ever want to just have fun? Be in a comedy? Show your lighter side?" But even as he spoke, there was something dismissive in his tone, as if he was reducing Denzel's entire career to a series of predictable choices. Denzel's response was measured but pointed. "Fun is subjective, Jimmy. I find purpose fulfilling. I choose roles that speak to something deeper than surface-level entertainment. But I suppose not everyone values substance over spectacle." The words were delivered with surgical precision, each syllable weighted with meaning that extended far beyond their conversation about movie roles. The studio fell unusually quiet. Even the house band seemed to sense they were witnessing something unprecedented. Kimmel's face flushed red as he realized he was being called out, not just as a host, but as someone whose entire career had been built on mockery and cheap laughs at others' expense. "Well, that's a very noble way to look at it," Kimmel stammered, trying to regain control of the interview. "But entertainment has value too. People need to laugh, especially these days with everything going on in the world." His voice carried a defensive edge that betrayed his growing frustration. Denzel nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Kimmel's face. "Absolutely. Laughter is important. But there's a difference between bringing joy and tearing others down for applause, between humor that uplifts and humor that diminishes." The implication was clear, and everyone in that studio knew exactly what he was referring to. The camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, sensing they were capturing something historic. This wasn't just small talk between a host and guest. This was a reckoning years in the making, as one of Hollywood's most respected figures faced off against a host whose reputation had been built on ridicule and controversy. Kimmel's nervous laughter echoed through the studio as he realized he was losing control of his own show. But what came next would push this confrontation to a point of no return. The desperation in Kimmel's eyes was unmistakable as he scrambled to regain his footing. In a move that would prove catastrophic, he decided to go on the offensive. "You know, Denzel, for someone who talks about uplifting people, you sure seem to look down on what I do for a living. Maybe you should step down from that moral high horse for a minute." The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. Even the production crew behind the cameras froze, sensing they had just witnessed a host cross a line that should never be crossed with a guest of Denzel's stature. The veteran actor's jaw tightened, his composed facade finally beginning to crack. "Moral high horse?" Denzel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it commanded more attention than any shout could have. "Jimmy, let me tell you about moral high horses. A moral high horse is when you punch down at people who can't punch back. A moral high horse is when you make a living mocking others' pain for cheap laughs. A moral high horse is when you hide behind 'it's just comedy' while you tear people apart on national television." The audience sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the polite, media-trained response they expected from celebrity interviews. This was raw, unfiltered truth being delivered with the precision of a master craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his ability to convey authentic emotion. Kimmel's face went from red to pale in seconds. He knew he had stepped into dangerous territory, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "That's rich coming from someone who's made millions playing characters who judge everyone around them. At least I'm honest about what I do. You hide behind this sanctimonious act like you're better than everyone else." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several audience members audibly gasped, and one camera operator actually stepped back from his equipment as if the tension might be physically dangerous. Denzel slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's face, and for a moment the silence stretched so long it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. "Sanctimonious act," Denzel repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that anyone who knew him would recognize as the moment before the storm. "Jimmy, let me share something with you about acts. An act is what you do every night when you pretend that cruelty is comedy. An act is what you do when you smile at your guests while planning to ambush them with your little prepared gotcha moments. An act is what you're doing right now, pretending you don't know exactly what you've become." The host's hands were visibly shaking now as he gripped his note cards. He had built his entire career on being the one asking uncomfortable questions, on putting his guests on the defensive, but now he found himself trapped in a spotlight that revealed every flaw in his character. "I don't have to sit here and take this from someone who thinks they're God's gift to Hollywood," Kimmel shot back, his voice cracking with barely contained rage. "You may fool everyone else with this dignified gentleman routine, but I see right through it. You're just another actor who believes his own press." That was the moment everything changed. Denzel stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame seeming to tower over the seated host, despite the stage setup designed to keep guests at eye level. The movement was so deliberate, so charged with purpose, that every person in that studio knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "Press?" Denzel's voice carried across the studio with the authority of someone who had commanded stages and screens for decades. "Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've seen hosts come and go. I've watched trends rise and fall, and I've learned to tell the difference between someone who entertains and someone who exploits. You want to know what I see when I look at you?" The camera zoomed in on Kimmel's face, capturing the mixture of fear and defiance that flickered across his features. He opened his mouth to respond, but Denzel wasn't finished. "I see someone who's forgotten that the people you mock on this show are human beings with families, with feelings, with dignity that you strip away for applause. I see someone who's convinced himself that mean-spirited attacks are the same thing as wit. I see someone who's lost sight of the fact that with this platform comes responsibility." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. Even the exit signs seemed to glow more brightly, as if anticipating what was about to happen. Kimmel, cornered and humiliated on his own show, was about to make the mistake that would define the rest of his career. In that moment of suffocating silence, Kimmel's desperation reached its breaking point, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and panic, as he realized his carefully constructed persona was crumbling in real time. What came out of his mouth next would shock even his harshest critics. "You know what, Denzel? Maybe you should worry less about lecturing me and more about staying relevant. When's the last time you had a hit movie that people actually cared about? At least I'm still pulling in ratings while you're out here preaching like some washed-up has-been who thinks Hollywood owes him something." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members actually stood up in shock, and one woman near the front audibly said, "Oh my God," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. The production staff behind the cameras were frantically making throat-cutting gestures, trying to signal for a commercial break. But it was too late to stop what had been unleashed. Denzel's response was swift and devastating. He took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now completely dominating the space. "Washed up has been?" His voice carried the weight of decades of experience, of respect earned through craft rather than controversy. "Jimmy, I've won 2 Academy Awards, been nominated for 10. I've directed films that will be studied in classrooms long after your show is a footnote in television history. But more importantly, I've done it without tearing others down to build myself up." The host's confidence completely evaporated as he realized the magnitude of what he had just said. Attacking Denzel Washington's career on national television wasn't just professional suicide. It was character assassination of himself. But his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "Awards don't mean everything," Kimmel stammered, his voice betraying his panic. "This is about connecting with real people, not some Hollywood elite circle jerk. My audience doesn't care about your Oscars. They want entertainment, not lectures from someone who probably hasn't had a real conversation with a regular person in decades." That was the final straw. Denzel's composure, maintained through decades of interviews and public appearances, finally shattered, not into rage, but into something far more dangerous: complete moral clarity delivered with devastating precision. "Regular people," Denzel repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. "Let me tell you about regular people, Jimmy. Regular people have dignity. Regular people deserve respect. Regular people don't tune in to watch you humiliate guests for sport. They tune in hoping to see something that lifts them up, that makes them feel better about their world, not worse." He gestured toward the audience, many of whom were now openly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. "Look at them. Look at their faces. These regular people you claim to represent. Do they look entertained? Or do they look like they're watching something ugly that they wish they could unsee?" Kimmel glanced at his audience and saw exactly what Denzel was describing. Faces filled with shock, disappointment, and embarrassment. Not for the guest, but for their host. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, but his ego was too bruised to allow any graceful retreat. "Don't lecture me about my own audience," he snapped, his voice rising to near-shouting levels. "You don't know anything about what they want. You live in some ivory tower making movies about noble characters, while the rest of us deal with reality. Maybe if you came down to earth once in a while, you'd understand what real entertainment looks like." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything in its path. Denzel stood perfectly still for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "Reality," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The reality is that you've forgotten what entertainment is supposed to be. The reality is that you've confused cruelty with comedy, mockery with wit, and destruction with entertainment. The reality is that you've used this platform not to bring joy, but to spread cynicism and meanness." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the studio. "And the saddest reality of all is that you don't even see it. You think what you do here is harmless fun, but you're poisoning the well of public discourse one joke at a time. Kimmel's face was now completely flushed, sweat visible on his forehead under the hot studio lights. He had lost control not just of the interview, but of his entire show, his reputation, and possibly his career. In a last desperate attempt to regain some semblance of authority, he made one final catastrophic mistake that would seal his fate and trigger the most dramatic exit in late-night television history. You know what? Kimmel stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward as he pointed an accusatory finger at Denzel. I'm sick of this holier-than-thou garbage. You want to talk about reality? The reality is that you're nothing but an overpaid, self-righteous actor who thinks he's better than everyone else. This is my show, and I don't have to sit here and take this sanctimonious crap from someone who's completely out of touch with real America. The studio erupted, not in applause or laughter, but in shocked gasps and uncomfortable murmurs that rippled through the audience like a wave of disbelief. Several people in the front row actually covered their mouths in horror. The band members looked at each other with expressions of complete bewilderment, unsure whether they should start playing or run for cover. Denzel's response was immediate and final. He removed his microphone with deliberate precision, the small clip-on device making a sharp sound as it disconnected. The gesture was so purposeful, so loaded with meaning, that it felt like watching someone hang up the phone on an entire industry. "Jimmy," Denzel said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed a complete moral collapse, "what you just said tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Not the character you play on television, not the persona your writers create for you, but the real person underneath all of that." He placed the microphone carefully on the coffee table between them, the small action somehow more dramatic than any theatrical gesture could have been. "I've spent 4 decades in this business, and I've met a lot of people. Some good, some not so good. But I've rarely met someone so completely divorced from their own impact on the world." The host tried to interrupt, but Denzel raised his hand. Not aggressively, but with such quiet authority that Kimmel actually stepped back. "You called me out of touch with real America," Denzel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Let me tell you about real America, Jimmy. Real America consists of people who work hard, who treat others with respect, who understand that words have consequences. Real America doesn't celebrate cruelty disguised as comedy. Real America knows the difference between entertainment and exploitation." The camera operators continued filming, but several production assistants had stopped what they were doing entirely, transfixed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a celebrity spat. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire, delivered by someone who understood exactly what was at stake in this moment. "This conversation is over," Denzel announced, beginning to move toward the edge of the stage. "But before I leave, I want your audience to understand something. What happened here tonight isn't about me, and it isn't really about you. It's about what we choose to accept as normal in our public discourse." He turned to address the studio audience directly, his presence commanding their complete attention. "You deserve better than this. You deserve entertainment that doesn't require someone else's humiliation. You deserve hosts who understand that their platform is a privilege, not a weapon." Kimmel, sensing his complete defeat, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Oh, come on, don't be so dramatic. This is just television. It's not that serious." The words seemed to echo in the stunned silence that followed. Even Kimmel seemed to realize immediately that he had just made the worst possible response, dismissing the very real impact of his behavior as just television, while standing in front of cameras that broadcast to millions of homes. Denzel stopped walking and turned back one final time, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Just television," he repeated. "Jimmy, just television reaches into people's homes every night. Just television shapes how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, how we see each other. There's no such thing as just television when you have this kind of influence. With that, he began walking toward the exit, his departure measured and dignified despite the chaos he was leaving behind. The audience began to applaud, not the polite, cued applause of a talk show, but genuine, sustained clapping that grew louder as more people joined in. Some audience members actually stood up, creating a standing ovation for a guest who was walking out on the show. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, watching his career implode in real time as his own audience applauded his guest's departure. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his complete humiliation, as Denzel Washington walked off his stage, with his dignity intact and his message delivered. As the studio doors closed behind him, the applause finally died down, leaving Kimmel alone with the wreckage of what had once been his reputation. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the continued hum of cameras that had just recorded the end of an era in late-night television. Within hours, clips of the confrontation would be viewed millions of times across social media platforms. The phrase, "This conversation is over," would become a rallying cry for those demanding better from their entertainment. And Jimmy Kimmel would discover that some mistakes are too public, too complete, and too revealing of character to ever fully recover from. The show that was supposed to end with laughs and applause instead concluded with the sound of a man's dignity walking out the door, leaving behind a host who had finally revealed exactly who he was when the cameras were rolling.